For Pacifica Radio, August 7th, 2022. I'm Scott Horton. This is Antiwar Radio. All right, y'all, welcome to the show. It is Antiwar Radio. I'm your host, Scott Horton. I'm editorial director of Antiwar.com and editor of the new book, Hotter Than the Sun, Time to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. You can find my full interview archive, more than 5,700 of them now, going back to 2003, at scotthorton.org and at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. And you can follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. All right, today's guest is Connor Freeman. He's assistant editor at the Libertarian Institute and is focused very sharply on American foreign policy, and he has a couple of important ones here at issue. First of all, Biden and allies continue to put Iran in the crosshairs. Welcome to the show, Connor. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Scott. Thanks for having me on.
All right, so you got this great piece about what's going on with Iran. Two important tracks there. On one hand, the never-ending negotiations over re-entering the Iran nuclear deal of 2015, and at the same time, all these hawkish preparations for war. And then you've got this other great piece about China we're going to talk about as well. But first of all, you know, the top headline on antiwar.com on Friday was that under European pressure, America re-enters JCPOA re-entry talks with the Iranians. And so it's not all the way dead yet, but please break down for us, what is the impasse on getting America back in the deal? And Iran, I guess, is still officially in the deal, but no longer abiding by it. But how do we get everybody reactivated here?
Yeah, so last time I was on your show, we talked about, we covered like virtually the middle of last year when Raisi's government took power, actually a little bit of the Rouhani negotiations, where Biden basically told them that if we return to the deal, if the U.S. returns to the deal and you're in compliance, we can still reimpose sanctions and impose new sanctions and basically kill the deal anyway. And so, but regardless, the Iranians stayed committed to diplomacy. Now, we talked about, a series of Israeli attacks on Iran, drone strikes, assassinations that there were potentially 6. Some of them are unverified, but 6 or so in almost a month, which is pretty unprecedented. That we talked about, a massive push in Congress from the Democrats, especially, and the Republicans. I just say more notably the Democrats, because they should be supporting this thing. And basically they said, the IRGC is the Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, blah, blah. And the IRGC, because of this and because how close they are to a nuclear bomb, we can never return to the deal. And so Biden basically, when the deal was practically finalized, by March, they had surpassed all these different obstacles. The Iranians essentially had the deal negotiated on their terms. And there was, as Joseph Borrell continues to, the foreign policy chief of the EU, continues to reiterate, even this week, that basically the deal is more or less done. He's saying that right now he has, with precision, broken down what needs to be done, the respective steps on both sides. What sanctions need to be lifted. This is what they're doing right now. What sanctions need to be lifted, the scope of sanctions relief that the U.S. will give Iran, and then what nuclear commitments Iran will return to, which they were in total compliance with until 2019, a year after Trump left the deal illegally and reimposed sanctions. And so that's all basically there and ready to go. What it is that the U.S. imposed new sanctions this week, for instance, maybe in anticipation of this, because what continues to happen is the Americans have this opportunity to return to the deal. It makes total sense. Now, originally, one of the arguments that I, was sympathetic to was that in advance of Biden's trip to the Middle East last month, where he was going to be going to Jeddah and going to Israel, and meeting with the Saudis and meeting with Yair Lapid, the new acting prime minister in Israel, that there, that because there had been these restarted talks in Doha that had been facilitated by the EU, or really brokered by the EU again. This is Enrique Mora, the nuclear negotiator, sort of the key diplomat in moderating all these indirect talks that were ongoing in Vienna until this one in Qatar. But, the Qataris support this, and so the EU also, they basically work together to facilitate these new talks. And of course, nothing came of that. But in advance of that, the Iranians had said, and it had been reported originally in Middle East Eye, that they had, dropped their demand for the IRGC to be, removed from the foreign terrorist organization blacklist that the State Department has. And this is a sweeping sanction that targets any and all, current or former members of the IRGC, including conscripts who served in non-military roles. So one of the things that happens is you see that there are families broken up where the wife is in the U.S. and she's a doctor, but her husband, who's also a doctor, can't get into the country because he was formerly in the IRGC, but again, serving like as a medic or something. There's been instances where musicians who are supposed to play, Iranian classical musicians who are supposed to play shows in the U.S. can't get into the United States because they formerly were in the IRGC. And it's really gratuitous because the National Iranian American Council has a great write-up about all of this. But basically, the IRGC is already under myriad sanctions. They've been like a globally designated terrorist organization since the end of the Bush II administration. They're actually sanctioned for, human rights abuses and ballistic missile sanctions. They're actually, I'm not making this up, they were sanctioned for, quote, election interference in the previous election with Biden and Trump. So it's just a gratuitous thing. It was put in place by people like, at the behest of people like Mark Dubowitz, the neocon who runs the Foundation for Defense Democracies, Donald Trump and his sort of neocon Zionist advisors built what they call a sanctions wall, which is basically designed to preclude any future administration, particularly Democrats, from ever returning to the JCPOA for fear of looking soft on terrorism in this case, right? But, in Elliot Abrams' point was that we're going to pile on all these sanctions and make it so complex that return to the deal will be impossible. So that's the agenda. And Biden has more or less played along with the whole thing. He went to the middle and, even though the Iranians removed this demand, it didn't make any difference in terms of the Americans, their position in the negotiations in Doha. And I predict that that'll be the same case here today. And I will point out to you that I read conflicting reports because right now, so the AP had a piece where they were talking about, the upcoming negotiations. And they were saying that the Iranians have now said that they said that the state-run news agency IRNA in Iran had said that they had not removed that demand, that they also said that until this whole dispute over the unprocessed traces of uranium that were found at these 3 undeclared sites, that America and Israel and Rafael Grossi, the director general of the IAEA, refused to let this issue go. And it's traditionally been used over the last few years as a way of thwarting diplomacy whenever it looks like things are going in Iran's favor. So they said, we're not going to restore this monitoring agreement, the voluntary monitoring agreement that has expired, a while ago. And after the IAEA or the U.S. And the Europeans censured Iran at the IAEA meeting a couple of months ago for for supposedly being intransigent on this issue and uncooperative with the IAEA, when the Iranians have said, no, we provided full documentation on all of this because we want to put this issue to bed. We're tired of it. And they provided the documentation in this deal that was cut with Grossi, I believe in March. They actually provided it ahead of schedule before this quarterly meeting, or however often the meeting comes up, I forget exactly. But this was this IAEA Board of Governors meeting a couple months ago. So after that, after they were censured, the Iranians, disconnected and several cameras, and they said basically that they would not. They were not going to turn them back on. Essentially, the IAEA wasn't even getting that footage anyway, because the monitoring agreement expired. Now, all the safeguards, the safeguards agreement under the NPT, that's all still active. And the Iranians have been very upfront about that. And they've said, look, 80% of the cameras are still in operation. We're completely in compliance with the safeguards agreement under the non-proliferation treaty. But we're not going to, what they have said, I guess, according to the Associated Press, is that they're not going to restore this monitoring agreement until the IAEA drops this whole provocative kind of dispute over these unprocessed traces of uranium at these sites. But what I read in Bloomberg today was they were saying that the Iranians, they spoke to European officials who said that the Iranians have indeed dropped this demand to have the IRGC removed from the FTO blacklist. And also, they said basically that they've also dropped their demand that Biden remain in the deal for the duration of this term, which ends in 2024. So they have basically, been more than cooperative. And they also said that there is some agreement, which is interesting. They weren't specific on indemnities to basically provide the Iranians with economic benefits, even if the Americans leave the deal again, or some future administration does, or if there's some act of Congress that kills the deal. So that's kind of where things stand now. I mean, they impose they do this all the time now. It's basically they'll sanction some Iranian petrochemical firm, and then almost always it's companies that are in China and the UAE. One of the reasons why they go after these companies in the UAE, I mean, from what I've been seeing, is basically, so at the end of last year, after the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan, there was this sort of outbreak of diplomacy where you had longtime adversaries speaking to each other and actually kind of engaging in a positive way. Because they actually did believe that the Americans were more or less leaving the Middle East and that whole region to focus on China, in particular with the Asia pivot, and also, Eurocom and Eastern Europe with NATO, and focusing on Russia now and the whole great power competition project. Now, that turned out not to be true, and I think Biden's administration and Brett McGurk did a real U-turn on all that. But you had the Emiratis speaking with the Turks all of a sudden, after the blockade had been lifted on Qatar. You had the Saudis speaking with the Qataris. You had the Iranians speaking with the Saudis. There's been a series of negotiations that were brokered by talks that have been brokered by Baghdad that have been going on that have shown some promise. But in particular, the UAE, their national security advisor, I think it's Mohammed bin Zayed's brother. But anyway, he went to Tehran. The national security advisor went to Tehran, and they discussed cooperating on a wide range of economic programs and all kinds of things. And the Israelis went absolutely ballistic and said that we're not going to tolerate an Abu Dhabi-Tehran axis. And the Americans said that they were going to tighten sanctions on the UAE to prevent them to prevent people in the UAE from doing business with Iran. And so, ever since then, we've seen a series of sanctions laid on Iran that target these companies in the UAE and China. They've always said, in fact, the Wall Street Journal report, I think last year as well, they're saying that basically there's nothing else to sanction in Iran except for their oil trade with East Asia. And so that's what we're seeing. And so when the sanctions were announced, someone asked Blinken, are you prepared to return to talks? And he basically sidestepped all their questions and said that, we don't really see that Iran is, let me get the quote. He said, it remains to be seen whether Iran is willing to, and able to move forward. But they've shown for more than a year now, they've shown that they have the full intent to do that. And it's the Americans who are completely dragging their feet. And they just went, when Biden went to Israel, he signed this joint declaration with Yair Lapid saying the Americans will use all their national power to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And basically said, their whole policy is basically that they will use force as a last resort. And as you can see, they're expanding the maximum pressure campaign and basically refusing diplomacy at this point, while at the same time, I don't think it's been very successful, thankfully. But there is this concurrent policy. Certainly the U.S. and Israel seem very interested in it, in building up this mini NATO style alliance led by the U.S., with Israel as sort of the number two, but grouping together all these Arab states that they believe can be a part of this military alliance that will surround Iran. And Benny Gantz has announced it's called the Middle East Air Defense alliance, and that he says the progress on it has been much more significant than is public. But I read a report in Reuters that we covered on conflicts of interest that Kyle Anzalone, our news editor at the Institute and opinion editor at Antiwar.com, we covered this. And basically, one of the things that came out in the Reuters report was that the Saudis and the Emiratis are not too enthusiastic about this. And again, they mentioned that they still are kind of holding out to see if they can have some kind of, more positive relationship with Iran, which is a good thing. And just speaking about all that diplomacy, I think that's one of the that was breaking out in the region, which Trita Parsi covered over at Responsible Statecraft quite a bit. I think that one of the major reasons why they are refusing to return to the Iran deal is because I think that would be facilitated, and the Israelis do not want that. The Israelis want to maintain, this permanent presence of the American hegemon in the Middle East. In fact, that was one of the things that Bennett demanded in his first meeting with Biden in the Oval Office in August, when he said, or maybe it was September, but or early September, late August, he said that his strategic vision for Iran is death by 1,000 cuts, basically myriad military and diplomatic attacks, as well as clandestine attacks and the gray area stuff. And he demanded that the U.S. remain indefinitely, U.S. troops in Syria and Iraq.
Sorry, hang on just one second. Hey, y'all, Scott Horton here for Tennessee Hot Sauce Company. Man, this stuff is so good. They get all different flavors. Garlic habanero, honey habanero, pineapple habanero, poblano jalapeno, and the blood orange ghost. They're all so good, I swear. And for a limited time, Tennessee Hot Sauce Company is featuring official Scott Horton hotter than the sun thermonuclear hot sauce. It's full of Carolina Reapers, scorpion peppers, Dr. Pepper, hydrogen isotopes, and all kinds of things that'll burn your tongue clean off. Seriously, it's really good. Get yourself a hot sauce subscription. Spend $40 or more and use promo code SCOTT to get a free bottle of hotter than the sun hot sauce. That's tnhotsauceco.com. Hey, y'all got to check out these awesome busts of our hero, the great Ron Paul. They're made by the renowned sculptor Rick Casali. They're 13 inches tall, hand-painted bronze resin based on Casali's brilliant original. Y'all may have seen mine in the background on my bookshelf in some recent interviews. The thing is unbelievable. Check out this incredible piece of art at rickcasali.com/Ron Paul, and you'll see what I mean. Use promo code Horton and you'll save $25, and this show will get a little kickback too. That's rickcasali.com/Ron Paul. Casali is Casali. rickcasali.com/Ron Paul. And there's free shipping too. All right, y'all. Well, now I have to stop and wish happy birthday to KPFK. You know, this station has been around for 63 years, which also means that my show, Antiwar Radio, has been on the air for more than 17% of KPFK's lifetime, which is pretty good. And it's fundraising time here again at KPFK. The number to pledge is 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-5735, or go to kpfk.org. Well, look, running a radio station is expensive. Fortunately, we're broadcasting from one of the wealthiest cities in the world, a place where just one B-list celebrity could afford to keep the station going for a quarter without even missing it. I know it's trendy for all the center-left liberal hacks to sidle up to the war machine. That's how they prove they're not supposed anti-American leftists, by supporting militarism and mass slaughter overseas, especially when Democrats are in power. But I know there's some proud anti-imperialists in Hollywood who care a lot more about ending war than looking compliant and acceptable before the war party. America desperately needs a principled, well-financed radical left that will prioritize peace and keeping up the pressure on liberal Democrats in office to stick with the people and not entrenched power. Just as the America First non-interventionist right is putting pressure on the Republican War Party, we have to keep the left focused on fighting that same kind of campaign against the Dems. Look at what's going on with the current Yemen War Powers resolutions. In the House, it's H.J. Res 87. H.J. Res 87. And in the Senate, it's S.J. Res 56. 56. Now, the vast majority of the co-sponsors of these resolutions right now are Democrats. And while some of them may specialize in this story and truly care, this is really about 99% due to the fact of the pressure created by left-wing, Quaker, and Yemeni expatriate communities in this country. Not a single cable TV news host has made this their priority. It gets essentially no coverage. But it's the worst war in the world, and we can help to end it. Tools like this radio station, the largest FM transmitter west of the Mississippi River, are absolutely essential. It won't be long for the whole world is suspended from Twitter for telling the truth about one thing or another. KPFK must remain. KPFK must remain so that we can get the word out and rally the forces of peace against the military-industrial complex and its minions. That's what this show and this station are all about. Since starting Antiwar Radio here on KPFK back in 2010, my expert guests and I have told the truth about and debunked every lie the Hawks have come up with to justify their interventions in Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, and Ukraine, as well as national security state law-breaking and scams like the Russiagate hoax. The bottom line here, guys, is that the U.S. federal government and its world empire murder people every day. And they lie from morning to night to justify it all. So, our job is telling the truth and convincing the rest of the population to get on board the consensus and end the war state before it ends us. But we need your help to do that. It's as simple as that. It's 818-985-5735 to pledge your support. 818-985-5735 or kpfk.org. Dig deep. Pitch in and let's get this part out of the way so we can get back to the real business of exposing lies and supporting peace. That's 818-985-5735 or kpfk.org. And thank you. All right, we're talking with Connor Freeman from the Libertarian Institute. And Connor, can you talk a little bit about the effect all these sanctions have had on the Iranian economy and for regular civilians there?
Yeah, I mean, from what I've seen, the estimates of the inflation rate is 40 to 50%. There have been medical shortages being reported by UN experts, Human Rights Watch, where basically, even though there's so-called exemptions for medical goods, the medical companies, pharmaceutical companies, banks, and basically anybody in between are just afraid to do any business with Iran on that level because they fear, facing the wrath of the Treasury Department. And now the estimates are that half of the Iranian population lives below the poverty line, and there's been, quite a bit of civil unrest going on in the country, bread over the prices of bread and things like this. I mean, this is essentially what the people like Richard Nephew, who calls himself a sanctions artist. This is what they like to see in countries where we wage economic war. In fact, just as far as, COVID hit the Iranian population very hard, and the Associated Press reported that U.S. sanctions, while allowing for humanitarian aid, have made international purchase of medicine and equipment much more difficult. Iran has endured multiple waves of the coronavirus with nearly 118,000 deaths recorded, the highest in the region. So, they applied for a loan from the IMF, and I believe it was for $5 billion. And the IMF, presumably under pressure from the U.S., denied loans respectively to Tehran and Caracas as well. This is obviously politically motivated. The sanctions policies have hurt worst people with cancers, multiple sclerosis, hemophilia, AIDS, diabetes, and epilepsy. And there's just terrible stories you can hear about people just being unable to obtain life-saving medicines. And also the prices of staple goods and foods have just become, and automobiles and housing have just become prohibitively expensive as a result of the economic war. And of course, the currency has just been largely destroyed.
Yeah. All right. Now, so you have this great piece at the Institute as well called The Next Giuliani Moment, No War with China. And of course, the Giuliani moment is, well, there are a lot of them, aren't there? This is the one where Ron Paul told the truth about the terror war all being blowback from the previous policy of dual containment in the Middle East in the 1990s in his big fight with Rudy Giuliani during the campaign of 2008. And so what's that got to do with China now? Let's start with that.
Yeah. Okay, so and I wrote this in anticipation of the Pelosi visit to Taiwan, which has caused probably the worst tensions around the island, at least since the third Taiwan Strait crisis. But it looks like this will actually be worse. And it was totally unnecessary, but it was also part and parcel of this Asia pivot that was launched by Barack Obama in 2011, the largest military buildup since World War II, shifting 2/3 of all air and naval forces to the Asia Pacific, targeting China. And it was expanded by Donald Trump and then vastly escalated under Joe Biden. And so my point here in particular was to say that, if I think the Giuliani moment, everybody would agree, was really a breakthrough, not just for Ron Paul, but for the anti-war movement. I think it was, at least in my lifetime, the first time that Republicans were basically allowed to say, we don't support this anymore, because Ron Paul stuck to his principles and said, you don't have to change anything else about, your conservative politics. You just have to understand that our actions have consequences. And how would we feel if somebody else did this to us? So what I was thinking was, because there is this real substantive, I think, at least on the part of the constituents, opposition to this new Cold War with Russia at this point. The American people see what's happening to their economy with food shortages and gas prices and inflation, and all they see is the Americans being told to suck it up and just pay for this war in Ukraine because it's about the liberal world order, and we're in it for the long haul, and we're prepared to support Ukraine until victory is won, like Nancy Pelosi said. And basically, the American people have been totally slapped in the face. And we're sending, it's $54 billion at this point that's been pledged to Ukraine, most of it in military spending. It's set to surpass the State Department's budget. And nuclear tensions and tensions with Russia are arguably worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis, because Biden is not speaking to Putin. And when Blinken did finally meet with Lavrov, he refused to discuss the war other than to make threats of severe consequences and all these things. So I basically applied this to China and said, look, this is, basically taking what Michael Bolden calls the Scott Horton rule, fighting the right from the right. And basically what I'm saying is, look, this is the Democrats' project. This is everybody you hate's project. Hillary Clinton said the South China Sea is a national security interest of the United States. Obama launched this Asia pivot. It's going to cost trillions of dollars. It's the main justification for these defense budgets that are getting close to $900 billion a year at this point. They call it the pacing threat. Everybody hates General Mark Milley, the Joint Chief of Staff. He says, until recently, America was the unchallenged global economic and military power. But with China's rise, that is changing, and we have to put a stop to this. And it's basically, I tried to basically show how it's very similar to the buildup with Russia. And so for the same reason, we should oppose this new Cold War with China. So, for instance, people might think Biden is weak on China, whatever, because of the Hunter Biden controversies or whatever it is, just in their media circles. But I wanted to point out, look, Biden, compared to Trump, has nearly doubled the number of aircraft carrier strike groups that have been sent into the South China Sea. He has flown 2,000 sorties. By November of last year, flew 2,000 sorties of spy planes and military planes in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Yellow Sea. Biden has sailed warships through the Taiwan Strait nearly every month. And we have troops now openly deployed to the island. We've openly, he has, in air quotes, gaffed several times, saying that we're committed to Taiwan's defense, that we'll fight China in a war with them. Before this crisis with Pelosi going to Taiwan, we had already sent the USS Ronald Reagan into the South China Sea to conduct war drills. He loosened decades-old restrictions on, U.S. officials engaging with Taiwan government officials, and basically the State Department's official policy now is to encourage deepening our unofficial relationship. And they've been sending congressional delegation after congressional delegation and all kinds of officials to Taiwan, stepping over the one China policy to the point where it's just almost irrelevant at this point, except that it's maintained the peace, since 1979.
50 years, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess my point to it's kind of like when you look at policy with Russia, if you look at like Reagan and George H.W. Bush, Reagan negotiating the INF Treaty and beginning ending the Cold War with Gorbachev, and Bush 1 reducing the nuclear stockpile down by tens of thousands and working with the Russians to do that. I mean, you look at the Republicans of today, and it just bears no resemblance because of they've been infected with neoconservatism. But my point with this article was to show that this policy is absolutely bipartisan. If you look at this new Taiwan Policy Act of 2022 that Bob Menendez has put in place, they're talking about turning Taiwan into a major non-NATO ally. Sending them $4.5 billion worth of weapons over 4 years, and they have all these sanctions that they want to impose on all these financial institutions in China, key industries, and virtually the entire political elite, including President Xi. And they're trying to turn the quadrilateral security dialogue with the U.S., Japan, India, and Australia into the foundation for a NATO-style alliance that'll surround China. And, of course, we have this,
which, of course, would embolden the Taiwanese to declare independence and provoke a war, which would be the most likely result of that and predictable enough. And I'm sorry, we're just out of time here, but it's really great stuff. Find Connor Freeman at the Libertarian Institute. That's libertarianinstitute.org. And these pieces are Biden and allies continue to put Iran in the crosshairs and the next Giuliani moment. No war with China. Thanks very much, Connor.
Thank you, Scott.
All right, y'all, and that is Antiwar Radio for this morning. I'm your host, Scott Horton. I'm the editorial director of Antiwar.com and the editor of the new book, Hotter Than the Sun, Time to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Find my full interview archive at scotthorton.org and youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. And follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. I'm here every Sunday morning from 9 to 9:30 on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA. See you next week.